It was a day meant to be filled with love, celebration, and new beginnings. The kind of day that brides and grooms dream about for years, planning every detail to perfection. The sun shone brightly, casting a golden glow over the outdoor venue where Emma and Jack stood, exchanging vows, surrounded by friends and family. There were flowers everywhere, and the air was filled with laughter and excitement. The day was everything they had hoped for. Emma, in her pristine white dress, looked radiant, and Jack, in his tailored suit, couldn't stop smiling. They were about to embark on the greatest journey of their lives. And there wasn't a soul at the ceremony who didn't believe that this would be the start of a beautiful, forever kind of love. After the vows were exchanged and the rings were slipped onto fingers, the celebration continued with music, food, and dancing. The reception was full of joy, everyone reveling in the happiness of the couple, cheering them on as they shared their first dance as husband and wife. Emma and Jack were in love, and everyone could see it. The air was thick with optimism as friends toasted to their health and happiness, and the couple laughed and smiled, basking in the attention. It seemed like a typical wedding day, the kind everyone hopes to remember forever. It was supposed to be a perfect beginning, but just days after the wedding, things took an unexpected and mysterious turn. What was once a storybook beginning became a dark, twisted tale. Just days after they'd exchanged vows, Emma and Jack vanished without a trace. The joyful, optimistic day they had spent celebrating their love quickly turned into a nightmare for their families, friends, and the entire community. At first, there was no reason to panic. It wasn't unusual for newlyweds to take a few days off after their wedding to enjoy a honeymoon or simply retreat into a quiet place to relax. Emma and Jack had planned a trip to a secluded cabin in the mountains, a peaceful getaway to unwind after the whirlwind of their wedding. The couple had always been the kind of people who value their privacy and enjoyed the simple, quiet moments. Their families thought nothing of it when the couple didn't immediately respond to text messages or phone calls. It wasn't out of character for them to disconnect for a bit. But as the days passed, the silence began to worry those closest to them. Emma's mother, always the one to check in on her daughter, no matter how old she got, was the first to raise concern. She had called and texted multiple times, but each attempt went unanswered. At first, she assumed maybe the couple was simply enjoying the isolation of their cabin and had turned off their phones to disconnect. But as days turned into a week, her concern grew deeper. She called Jack's family, asking if they had heard from him, but no one had. The silence was unsettling. When Emma's mother finally reached out to the authorities, the search began, though no one truly understood where to start. The couple's cabin was on a remote property, but the area was known, and authorities had no reason to believe there was foul play. As the days stretched on, investigators checked their home, their car, their social media accounts, and even their bank records. There were no signs of struggle at the house, no signs that anything was out of place. The couple's belongings remained where they were supposed to be, and their clothes were folded neatly in the closet. The car was parked in the driveway as if they had just left moments ago, but there was no sign of Emma or Jack. It was as though they had just evaporated into thin air. Family members and friends grew more anxious. Their worst fears began to take shape. The thought that something terrible had happened to them began to creep into everyone's minds. No one could explain it. There were no signs of foul play, no break-ins, no ransom notes, and no mysterious phone calls. The only thing that remained was the eerie silence. Emma's mother and Jack's father worked closely with investigators, trying to piece together any lead that might help. They combed through their social media accounts, searching for any hint that could provide a clue. But everything seemed normal. There were no messages that stood out, no strange encounters, nothing that hinted at the couple being in any kind of danger. The more time that passed, the less likely it seemed that Emma and Jack had run away. They had no reason to. Their marriage was happy, their families were supportive, and they had big plans for the future. They were looking forward to building a life together. The idea that they had simply disappeared without any trace of a fight or argument seemed impossible. It didn't make sense. The more the investigation went on, the more the mystery deepened. As weeks passed without any sign of the couple, the story began to fade from the headlines. The case was still open, but there were no new developments. The police were doing their best, but without any clues, it was hard to know where to focus their efforts. The family continued to search for answers, but with every day that passed, their hope began to dwindle. Then, months later, something unexpected happened. Investigators got a new lead. A mysterious phone call from an anonymous source. This tip would become the key to unlocking the truth behind the couple's disappearance. The person on the other end of the line claimed to know where Emma and Jack were and what had happened to them. What followed would shock everyone involved, turning the investigation upside down. What was once a case of a missing couple would soon turn into something far more sinister. It wasn't a random disappearance after all. There was a hidden truth waiting to be uncovered, a story that had remained buried for far too long. The couple's fate was far darker than anyone had imagined, and the investigation was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. The mystery of Emma and Jack was just beginning to unfold, and the answers were closer than anyone realized. As the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into months, the investigation into the mysterious disappearance of Emma and Jack began to lose its momentum. What had started as an urgent, highly publicized case slowly faded from the headlines as time went on, and the evidence remained scarce. Investigators scoured every corner of their home, hoping to find some kind of clue, some sign that would give them a hint as to where the couple had gone or what had happened to them. Every drawer was opened, every closet checked, and every piece of their personal lives was examined thoroughly. But all of it led to dead ends. Jack's family members reported that there were no signs of a struggle at the couple's house. It was as if they had simply walked out and never returned. Their personal belongings, clothing, and even the keys to their car were all left behind. Emma's phone was discovered sitting on the kitchen counter, unlocked and untouched. There were no recent messages, no calls that might indicate a sudden departure, and no signs of any tension between the couple. In fact, everything seemed perfectly normal, right up until the moment they vanished. Their house was calm, neat, and orderly, almost as if they were planning to return any minute. But that minute never came. It was as though the couple had simply evaporated into thin air. The lack of any substantial evidence only deepened the mystery and frustration for both the families and the law enforcement officials involved in the case. Without a clear direction to follow, the investigation began to lose steam. The more time that passed, the more it seemed like Emma and Jack had somehow vanished by choice. But why? If they had run away, why leave everything behind? Why not even leave a note or some sort of indication of what had happened? The more the investigators looked into the case, the more baffling it became. In the absence of concrete evidence, the authorities, along with private investigators hired by the families, began to explore other theories. Could they have staged their own disappearance? Perhaps, some speculated, they were trying to escape something in their lives. Had they run away to start a new life, free from the pressures of their families, their wedding, or other personal matters? That seemed unlikely, given the fact that Emma and Jack had appeared to be deeply in love and had a solid relationship with their families. There had been no signs of trouble in their marriage, no arguments, and no indications that they were unhappy. All the more perplexing was the fact that their bank accounts and credit cards remained untouched. There was no sign that they were spending money in any way that would suggest they had gone into hiding. As the months passed, law enforcement's focus shifted. With no leads, no suspects, and no explanations, the case began to slip into the realm of unsolved disappearances, another mystery that could possibly remain unsolved forever. But even though the official investigation appeared to stall, the families of Emma and Jack refused to give up hope. They continued to push for answers, hoping that someone, anyone, might have seen something or remembered a small detail that could break the case wide open. Yet, as the weeks turned into months and the months into a year, the question of where Emma and Jack had gone seemed further out of reach than ever before. Then, something completely unexpected happened that would change everything. A year after their wedding, a full 12 months of silence, unanswered questions, and growing despair, the investigation received a sudden and shocking breakthrough. What came next would send shockwaves through the entire investigation and completely alter the course of the case. It was a tip, a single, anonymous phone call to law enforcement that would set everything into motion. The caller claimed to have knowledge of what had happened to Emma and Jack. For months, investigators had been spinning their wheels, grasping at any theory, hoping for anything that would shed light on the mystery. This call, however, seemed different. The person on the other end of the line spoke with a certain calmness, as though they knew exactly what had transpired, as if they had been a part of the story all along. The tipster didn't give much information at first, only that they knew where Emma and Jack were. At first, law enforcement wasn't sure whether to take this new lead seriously, but the detail in the caller's voice and the eerie certainty they exhibited convinced them to follow up. The tipster suggested that investigators revisit a location near the couple's home, one that had previously been overlooked in their initial search. It was a small, old property that had been abandoned for years. The tipper hinted that something hidden there would explain the couple's disappearance. Law enforcement, eager to follow any lead that could break the case wide open, sent a team of investigators to the location. What they found there would be even more shocking than they could have imagined. Beneath the floorboards of the decaying structure, hidden from plain sight, was a trapdoor, a secret space that had been concealed for years. The area was dusty and forgotten, almost as if time itself had passed over it. But it was what lay beneath that trapdoor that left everyone stunned. The discovery inside that hidden room would be the key to understanding Emma and Jack's disappearance. It turned out that the couple had not run away as some had thought. They hadn't staged their own disappearance either. Instead, they had been trapped, hidden away by a force that had been far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. What investigators found next would lead them on a path of dark secrets, a twisted web of deception, and a story that had been buried beneath layers of lies and fear. The trapdoor revealed a series of photographs, snapshots of Emma and Jack, but these weren't pictures of them smiling or celebrating. They were pictures taken after their wedding, showing them in a state of fear, anxiety, and distress. It became clear that the couple had been held captive, forced into hiding against their will. But who had taken them? And why? The answers to these questions were slowly uncovered in the months that followed. The discovery of the trapdoor and the eerie photographs was just the beginning. The truth behind Emma and Jack's disappearance was more chilling and complex than anyone could have imagined. What had started as a mystery of a missing couple would soon unfold into one of the most disturbing cases law enforcement had ever seen. It was a quiet afternoon when investigators received an anonymous tip that would alter the course of the case forever. The tip came from a local contractor who had been working on a nearby property, an old house that had been abandoned for years. The contractor had been tasked with renovating the property, updating it for potential buyers, when he made a discovery that would send shockwaves through the investigation into the disappearance of Emma and Jack. As the contractor was working in one of the rooms, he noticed something unusual beneath the floorboards, a hidden trapdoor. At first, it seemed like a simple oddity, nothing out of the ordinary in an old building like this one. But when he moved aside the dusty floorboards and opened the trapdoor, he realized that something much more significant was hidden underneath. The trapdoor had clearly been sealed for years, its edges marked with dirt and debris, as if it hadn't been opened in a very long time. The layers of dust and the cobwebs that clung to the edges gave the impression that this was not a place that had seen any kind of human activity in ages. What immediately caught the contractor's attention was not just the trapdoor itself, but the feeling that something hidden beneath it had been deliberately concealed. It didn't feel like a mere storage space or a forgotten part of the building. There was something about it that seemed intentionally kept from sight. The contractor knew that this could be important, so he called the authorities right away, unaware of just how significant this discovery would be. When law enforcement arrived and began to investigate the area, they quickly realized that the trapdoor was not just a random find. Beneath it lay a hidden underground room, one that had been sealed off for years. It was a small, dark space, the walls lined with peeling paint and faded wallpaper. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and decay, and the only light came from the small flashlight the investigators carried. What they found inside the hidden room would send chills down their spines. Among the dust-covered floorboards, there was a small collection of personal items, but it was the photographs that immediately caught the investigators' attention. As they sifted through the piles of old papers and debris, a series of photographs came into view. These were not ordinary photographs. They were photographs of Emma and Jack. The investigators were stunned. The couple's faces, which had once been part of the joyful celebrations of their wedding day, now seemed almost unrecognizable. In these photographs, they were not smiling or celebrating. Instead, they looked terrified. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes wide with fear, and they appeared to be hiding from something or someone. The pictures had been taken not long after their wedding, and there was an undeniable sense of anxiety and distress in every image. But why would Emma and Jack, a newlywed couple full of hope and love, hide beneath a trapdoor? The investigators were left with more questions than answers. There was no explanation for why they would be in such a place. What had they been running from? Why were they hiding? And perhaps most chilling of all, who had taken these photos? The idea that someone had been watching them, possibly even controlling their actions, was a thought that haunted the investigators as they stared at the pictures. These were not happy moments from their honeymoon. These were moments of fear and uncertainty, moments that suggested they had been trapped in this hidden room against their will. As the investigators delved deeper into the scene, they discovered even more unsettling details. Along the walls of the hidden space were strange markings, symbols and scratches that appeared to have been made intentionally, though no one could understand their meaning at first. They were crude and unprofessional, but they had been carefully carved into the walls, almost as if they were trying to communicate something. The markings were not random. They were purposeful. Someone had been spending a lot of time in this underground room, and the evidence suggested that Emma and Jack had been among them. The walls were also covered in faint impressions of objects that had once been in the room. It was clear that Emma and Jack had spent a considerable amount of time here. But how had they ended up in this hidden space? The more the investigators examined the room, the more it became apparent that they had been kept there for some time, perhaps even weeks. But how had no one noticed their absence during this period? The couple's families, friends, and co-workers had all been looking for them, but the hidden space beneath the trapdoor had remained completely undetected. No one had any idea where they were, and it seemed as though they had just disappeared from the face of the earth. The realization that they had been so close to their loved ones, yet hidden away in a room no one knew about, was a terrifying thought. The investigation took a dark turn as law enforcement began to piece together the timeline of events. The photos, the markings on the walls, and the overall condition of the underground room all suggested that Emma and Jack had been held captive, perhaps against their will. They had been trapped in this hidden space, forced to live in fear, possibly by someone they knew, or even by someone they had crossed paths with. The idea that someone had intentionally kept them hidden away in this room was becoming increasingly likely. As investigators worked tirelessly to analyze the photos and the strange markings on the walls, they began to uncover more clues that pointed toward a sinister plot. The couple's disappearance was no longer a simple case of two people vanishing without explanation. It was becoming clear that Emma and Jack had been targeted, and someone had been watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. But who could have done such a thing, and why? As these questions lingered in the minds of investigators, the mystery deepened even further. The hidden room beneath the trapdoor was just the beginning of a much larger and more complex investigation. There were still so many unanswered questions, but the discovery of this space marked a turning point in the case. Emma and Jack's disappearance was no longer just a tragic mystery. It was a story of deception, fear, and a dark force that had been lurking in the shadows all along. What had started as a search for two missing people had now become a quest for justice, and the investigators knew that they were only scratching the surface of a much larger, far more disturbing story. The discovery of the trapdoor beneath the old house was only the beginning of a much darker and more complex story than anyone had anticipated. At first, investigators were puzzled. What was this hidden space, and why was it so carefully concealed? Why had Emma and Jack been forced to spend time there? And what could possibly explain their fear and anxiety in the photos found beneath the trapdoor? These questions seemed to multiply as the investigation deepened, and with each new piece of evidence, the truth grew more chilling. What was initially thought to be an unfortunate coincidence soon seemed to reveal the presence of a much more sinister force at play. The more authorities dug into the history of the house where the trapdoor had been discovered, the more unsettling details emerged. It turned out that the house had once been owned by a man whose name was infamous in the area. This individual, whose reputation had long been marred by rumors and shady dealings, had a dark and twisted past that few dared to speak of. The man had once been involved in a variety of illegal activities, including organized crime, black market deals, and a series of other nefarious operations. It seemed that the house, which had long been abandoned, had been a central figure in these activities, a place where illegal deals were made and dangerous encounters took place. For years, the house had been left in disrepair, and no one had dared to go near it. But now, with the discovery of the trapdoor, everything had changed. The authorities learned that the man who had once owned the property had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and his whereabouts were still unknown. However, his legacy of criminal activities had lingered, and it seemed that his influence still haunted the town. But how did Emma and Jack, a young couple so full of love and hope, end up entangled in the dangerous web of this infamous figure's past? As investigators continued their search for answers, they uncovered a disturbing connection. It turned out that Emma and Jack had crossed paths with this man shortly before their disappearance. The couple had attended a wedding anniversary celebration at a nearby venue, an event that seemed completely unrelated to the mysteries that would soon unfold. It was at this event that Emma and Jack met the person who would ultimately drag them into a nightmare. The man had been present at the celebration, a quiet and unassuming figure who had initially seemed harmless. At first, he appeared to be just another guest at the event, blending in with the other attendees, but something about him had caught Emma's attention. What seemed like an innocent encounter soon turned into something much darker. According to new evidence that came to light during the investigation, this individual had become obsessed with Emma almost immediately. His initial interest appeared to be nothing more than a harmless conversation, but in retrospect, it became clear that his fascination with Emma was far from innocent. He had begun to follow her, showing up unexpectedly at places where she would be, and making strange and unsettling comments. At first, Emma had been polite, brushing off the man's advances as the behavior of a harmless stranger. However, as the weeks went on, his obsession grew, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and troubling. The man's obsession with Emma quickly morphed into something far more sinister. His attempts to make contact became more persistent, and it wasn't long before he began making veiled threats, hinting that he knew things about Emma and Jack that they had never shared with anyone. He began manipulating the couple, planting seeds of doubt in their minds and making them question their safety. At first, Emma and Jack thought it was just an isolated incident, a creepy encounter with a stranger that would eventually fade away. But the man's persistence grew, and the couple began to realize that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. It soon became clear that the man's interest in Emma was not a passing fancy. He had become obsessed with her, and what had started as an innocent meeting at a wedding anniversary celebration quickly turned into a nightmare that neither Emma nor Jack could escape. The couple had unwittingly walked into a trap, and they didn't even realize it until it was too late. The man's obsession escalated, and the threats grew more menacing. What had started as a few uncomfortable encounters soon turned into a full-blown campaign of manipulation, intimidation, and terror. At this point, the couple was no longer in control of their own lives. They had been caught in a web of fear and manipulation, and there was no way out. The man, with his connections to the criminal underworld and his knowledge of the couple's personal lives, had created a trap that was impossible for them to escape. Emma and Jack were being watched, controlled, and manipulated at every turn. The man's actions had become increasingly dangerous, and the couple's every move was being monitored. They were trapped in a nightmare, and the authorities were too late to intervene before things had spiraled out of control. The couple's decision to disappear had not been a voluntary one. It was the culmination of a series of frightening events that had left them with no choice. They had been forced to leave, not out of fear of the law or their families, but because they were facing a far more powerful and dangerous enemy. This individual, whose obsession had turned into something darker and more twisted, had left Emma and Jack with no other option but to flee. But even in their flight, they had been trapped. The man's hold on them was so strong that they had no chance of escaping his control. They had been forced to disappear, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice. Emma and Jack's disappearance was no longer just the story of a young couple vanishing into thin air. It was the story of how a dangerous, obsessive individual had trapped them in his dark world and manipulated their every move. The authorities were slowly beginning to piece together the truth, but it was becoming clear that they had been up against something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Emma and Jack had been victims, not of a simple disappearance, but of a carefully orchestrated trap set by someone who would stop at nothing to control their lives. As the investigation continued, the authorities knew that they were only beginning to understand the depth of the danger that had surrounded Emma and Jack. The trap they had fallen into was far more complex and far-reaching than anyone had initially realized, and the truth was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. What had started as an innocent encounter at a wedding anniversary celebration had turned into a terrifying story of manipulation, control, and obsession. And now, the authorities were determined to bring those responsible to justice. The truth about Emma and Jack's final moments was as chilling as the discovery of the hidden trapdoor itself. The investigation into their disappearance had already taken unexpected twists and turns, but as the authorities pieced together the final movements of the couple, a much darker and more terrifying reality began to emerge. What had initially seemed like a case of two people simply vanishing into thin air was, in fact, the result of a much more sinister plot. The couple's fate was no longer a mystery of accidental disappearance, but a harrowing tale of abduction, captivity, and a twisted obsession that had led them into the depths of fear. Investigators managed to piece together the couple's movements from various sources: surveillance footage, witness statements, and the chilling evidence found in the hidden room beneath the trapdoor. It was revealed that Emma and Jack had been taken against their will, dragged into the very house where the trapdoor had been discovered and kept hidden there for weeks. This house, which had long been abandoned and seemed to be nothing more than a decaying relic of the past, had actually been the prison in which the couple had been trapped. A secret room, concealed for years, had become their prison, a place where they were forced to wait in terror for an opportunity to escape. What made the situation even more horrifying was that the room in which they were held was not just physically isolating. It was psychologically tormenting. The couple had no access to the outside world, no communication with their families or friends, and no knowledge of what was happening outside the walls of their dark, hidden cell. They were isolated, trapped in a space where time seemed to stand still, and their only option was to wait for the right moment to flee. But each passing day only made it harder for them to find a way out, and as time went on, the couple's health and spirits began to deteriorate. The photos found beneath the trapdoor, which had been taken over the course of the weeks they were held captive, painted a heartbreaking picture of their decline. At first, the images were filled with uncertainty, but still there was a glimmer of hope in their eyes. Emma and Jack had initially tried to remain optimistic, convinced that somehow they would find a way out. But as the days turned into weeks and their situation grew more desperate, the photos became darker. The couple's faces became gaunt, their expressions hollow and filled with fear. Their eyes, once bright and full of life, now reflected the anguish and hopelessness they were feeling. The photos showed the slow unraveling of their spirits. In some of the pictures, they were huddled together in the corner of the hidden room, trying to find some comfort in each other's presence. In others, they seemed to be physically weakened, unable to hold themselves up for long periods. As the couple became more desperate, their once vibrant love began to fade, replaced by a need for survival. Every attempt to escape was met with failure, and every passing day left them feeling more trapped than ever before. And then, just as suddenly as the photos began, they stopped. The photos, which had once chronicled the couple's struggle for freedom, abruptly came to an end. No more pictures, no more signs of their gradual decline. The silence that followed was deafening. The authorities couldn't explain why the photos had stopped or what had happened during the period that followed. The couple's disappearance once again became a haunting mystery. Had they escaped? Had something worse happened to them? The disappearance of Emma and Jack after the photos stopped being taken raised more questions than it answered, and the investigation went cold once again. Months passed, and the case seemed to stall. Investigators followed leads, questioned potential witnesses, and tried to piece together the puzzle, but it felt as though they were chasing shadows. The most significant breakthrough came only after much persistence. After months of combing through every scrap of evidence, the authorities were finally able to trace the events back to the person responsible for the couple's abduction and captivity. The discovery of the man's involvement in the plot was a shocking revelation, one that brought the entire investigation into focus. However, by the time the authorities closed in on him, it was already too late. The man responsible for trapping Emma and Jack in that hidden room, the one whose twisted obsession had caused so much suffering, had vanished without a trace. He had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind only his dark legacy and a trail of unanswered questions. Despite an intense manhunt and a nationwide search, the man's whereabouts remained unknown. He had successfully evaded capture, leaving behind no clues as to where he might have gone or how to find him. It was as if he had vanished just as mysteriously as the couple had, slipping through the cracks of the investigation and disappearing into the unknown. Emma and Jack's story, once a bright and hopeful tale of young love and new beginnings, had turned into one of the most haunting mysteries of the decade. Their wedding, which was meant to mark the start of a beautiful life together, had instead become the tragic prologue to a terrifying tale of fear, captivity, and loss. The discovery of the trapdoor and the dark secrets hidden within it had been the catalyst for unraveling the truth, But the final revelation of what happened to Emma and Jack left the community forever shaken. Though the authorities continued their search and the case remained open, the truth was that Emma and Jack's story would forever be one of the great unsolved mysteries. The couple's fate remained a tragic enigma, and their disappearance became a symbol of the dangers that lurk in the most unexpected places. For those who had known the couple, their loss would never be forgotten. The haunting images of their decline, the secret room where they had been held captive, and the sinister figure who had orchestrated their suffering all served as a stark reminder that some secrets are buried far deeper than we could ever imagine. For the families and friends left behind, Emma and Jack's disappearance was more than just a tragedy. It was a warning, a reminder that sometimes, even the most seemingly innocent events can lead to terrifying consequences. While their case remains open, the truth behind their disappearance is something that may never fully be uncovered. But for those who knew them, Emma and Jack will always be remembered, not just for the love they shared, but for the chilling story that surrounds their tragic end.